For this video, we are going to review some stories told by the community in r/army, with the thematic of, do you have any ghost stories? With no more time to waste,
Let's get to it.
I have one. I was at basic training at Fort Jackson in 2009, and we were in the woods doing our 7-day FTX. We were doing guard one night, and there were rumors that the drill sergeants were going to attack us that night. I was at a checkpoint with 2 other guys. It was just a dark dirt trail in the middle of the woods with thick brush on both sides of the trail and just a few feet away from the tree line in either direction. I can't remember if our shift was 1 or 2 hours, but it was around 2 a.m. and close to the end of it. Despite it being so late, all 3 of us were on and super alert because we were a bunch of high-speed dorks, and we weren't going to get shown up by the DSs. So finally we saw, about a quarter mile away, a flashlight coming up the trail. It was bouncing up and down, just like someone holding a flashlight and walking at a medium pace. We all saw it immediately and got into position and waited, watching it come up the trail. All 3 of us stared at that light coming closer and closer for probably about 5 minutes straight, occasionally whispering to ourselves about what we were supposed to do and whatever. Finally, just as the thing got close enough to where we should see the person behind the light, maybe 20 or 30 meters away, the light veered of the trail and into the brush in a way that it couldn't have done if it was a person with a flashlight. There was no slowing down, or choppy steps or whatever. Then, just as it got to the point that it was obvious that there was no person, it took off floating, maybe 10 or 15 feet into the air, still heading towards us, but now in the woodline instead of on the trail. When it got to about maybe 10 feet away from us, it literally just fizzled out with a little light trail and disappeared. We were all just like, what the fuck was that? And spent the next 10 minutes of our shift in silence, before we went back to the tents. No drill sergeants came through that night. I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. I have some stories to tell, stories that don't quite sit right with me. I wasn't sure where else to share them, so I figured I'd leave them here. I've been in SAR for a few years now. I've seen things, strange things, that I think you'd find interesting. Most of the time, when people go missing, it's simple. They stray off the trail, slip down a hill, get turned around, lost, but not gone. Usually, they remember the golden rule. Asterisk, asterisk, stay where you are. Asterisk, and they're found. Scared, but safe. But not always. There are 2 cases that I can't shake. 2 people who were never found. 2 searches that kept me up for nights after they ended. I use them as a reason to push harder every time we go out. The first was a little boy. He was out picking berries with his parents, just an ordinary afternoon. He and his sister were together, and in the span of a few seconds both disappeared. Their parents turned their heads, and when they looked back, nothing. Gone. We got the call, and we searched the area. Fast. Thorough. We found the girl not long after. She was sitting on a rock, completely calm. When we asked her where her brother was, she looked up at us and said, asterisk. The bear man took him. Asterisk. She told us he gave her berries, told her to be quiet, said he just wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last thing she saw was her brother riding on his shoulders. She said he looked calm, not afraid. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we found no tracks. No signs. No one else in the area. Nothing. And the girl, she was clear. Unshaken. She said it wasn't a man, not a normal one. He was tall, covered in hair, like a bear. But his face was strange. Asterisk, weird. Asterisk, asterisk, she said. We searched that forest for weeks. One of the longest cases I've ever been on. We found nothing. Not a shoe. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a footprint. The second case was a young woman, hiking with her mom and grandfather. They told us she climbed a tree, wanted a better view of the forest. They saw her go up, but not come down. They waited. Hours. Calling her name. Nothing. We searched every tree, every ridge, every path. No broken branches. No scent. No sign of movement. It's like she climbed up and just vanished into the air. Her mother swears she never saw her descend, and her grandfather Well, he just kept looking up at the tree, silent, pale. I have no idea where she could have gone, and that haunts me. A few times I've been out on my own, searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs, not hills, not even rock faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of
a body.
a 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got
Impaled on
a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the
body
bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had
died with her
daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed
herself.
a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to. And we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered
The hell out of me.
I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped, turned around, and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say, I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. So I logged back on tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new. I saw one set that looked like they came from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely, or farther than I can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house, as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time. And I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't really promise anything. Alright, onto the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls. People who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids. Get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases, where we never find any trace of them, so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio telling us to all head back to the vet's location, and we come right away, because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need a full team to help get them out safely. We meet back up, and the vet is just standing at the base of a tree, with his hands on the sides of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points up into the branches of this tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. There's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch, and it's just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose his scent long before this tree. Eventually, the search is called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we'd found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That, and the questions that were raised. How the hell had this guy's cane ended up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks a lot about kids SAR teams find in places they shouldn't be or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up, and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her, when she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asks her other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy, so of course she freaks out, starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now obviously she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got the other 2 kids, so she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond, and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search peters out, and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to, on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. This slope is treacherous, and it's hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Of that, I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty, so it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects, and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. I've shared this one before, but the unit I was in while in Korea was allowed to have 1 soldier on CQ at a time, because we had to meet manning requirements, and 8A wouldn't accept the ETP, our leadership would submit to exempt us from CQ. I'm the only one awake in the barracks, to my knowledge. Noticed myself nodding off and did a check through to stay awake. Each floor I'm walking through, I occasionally heard whispering. When I first heard it, I thought maybe someone was on the phone and didn't want to wake their roommate or neighbor and was in the center stairwell. But like I said, I heard it on each floor. When I walked in the stairwell, it sounded like quiet talking. Something above a whisper, but not quite as loud as you would if you were talking at work or something. However, no one was in the stairwell with me. The day rooms were all empty. Not a single sign of anyone awake besides me. It was weird. To keep myself from freaking out too much, I tried to convince myself that I was just tired and imagining things. Alright, I actually have something to contribute for once. In Afghanistan, doing overnight radio guard in the CP. About 0230, me and the other guy are bullshitting, fighting the sleep monster. All of a sudden, we both hear and promptly ignore something that sounds like an abnormally large, bass-voiced goat bleeding out in pain. It sounded far away, so we continued bullshitting. Then, not even 10 seconds later, we hear it again, but it's now twice as loud, and it sounds like it's coming from above and behind us. We both looked at each other and froze for a few seconds, and every hair on my body was standing on end. We jumped up, grabbed our rifles, and ran outside to take a look, We were running away from the sound like little bitches. We saw and heard nothing, and are both now confused. Then, my mind turns to the civilian advisor who lives on the compound with us. The dude is tough as nails, but he's also old. Did we just run out on him having a heart attack? We rush back inside, and lo and behold, we see him up and walking around, looking confused. "Sir, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Were you two making that bloody noise?" "We thought that was you." "Well, I thought it was you guys." "Well, at least we know it wasn't our imaginations. But now what?" "The civilian says something along the lines of, you guys need to check all the rooms." So that's what we did. The only two POGs in the entire infantry company, sloppily clearing rooms. Now mind you, this civilian is a British expat, who later became an American citizen after fighting in Northern Ireland. This man could have at least told how not to look dumb while clearing, but no, he just sat back and watched us bumblefuck our way through it. Anyway, after clearing the rooms, we didn't find anything, so we woke up our XO and told him about strange noises. He basically told us to stop being sissies and go back on watch. The rest of the night was uneventful, and nobody else ever experienced anything similar. I'm an extremely skeptical person, so I obviously don't think it was a ghost. But I really don't have a good explanation. It may have been the unit across the street pranking us, or it could have been some animal. I really do not know. All I know was that I did hear something. Alright, here's my one and only ghost story. I was a young soldier at my first duty station. We had been moved from Turner Barracks in West Berlin to Andrews Barracks across town while they remodeled Turner. It was summer in Berlin, it was a Sunday night. I was sitting in the barred window of a basement laundry just up the street from the barracks. Pretty much all ground level windows were barred on Andrews, so at the time I thought nothing of it. The laundry was near the end of a low corridor with overhead plumbing that you had to hit a timer switch to light. In the laundry, aside from washers and dryers, there were only two items of note, a Kiss pinball machine and an old jukebox. As I sit in the window reading a book, I have the place to myself. It's late, and Sunday night is my go-to for laundry for this very reason. Suddenly, I hear a noise, a metallic click and whirl. It's coming from the jukebox. Since I'm the only one there, my first thought is I'm being pranked. I hop off the windowsill and dart to the hall, slapping the light timer. The hall is empty. I glance down at my Timex as the needle drops on a record. It's midnight on the dot. Music begins to blare from the jukebox. A cold sweat suddenly erupts, and I feel it trickle down my back. Living easy. I spring into action, wrenching the dryer open and slamming damp BDUs into my laundry bag. Loving free. I want so badly to be anywhere else. Season ticket on a one-way ride. I know damn well where this song is leading, and I have no intention of being in the laundry room when the chorus hits. I beat a hasty retreat back to barracks and a fitful night of sleep. The next day, I say nothing to anyone, until after final formation I see an older SSG on CQ. He's drinking coffee that is most likely spiked with Baileys, and he's on his second 3-year hitch in Berlin, not in my platoon. In short, he's the perfect person to ask about ghostly events. So I open with, "You ever hear of anything strange happening here at Andrews, SSGB?" He immediately breaks into a grin. "Well, for starters, talk to anyone over in HQ Barracks, and they'll tell you about the late-night phantoms marching in the halls." He proceeds to tell me about people whipping doors open late at night to tell whoever was doing D&C in the hall to cut it out, only to find an empty hall with only one central stairwell. So encouraged by the fact maybe my story isn't so ridiculous, I broach the topic of the laundry. "Anything in particular about the basement laundry?" I ask. As a matter of fact, yes, SPC. I can tell by the way he rocks back in his chair and grins, I'm not going to be reassured by what comes next. The laundry was a cell where Hitler tortured his political rivals to death on the night of the Long Knives. I blinked a couple of times, then thanked him for the history lesson, and decided late-night laundry was no longer an option. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the Goat Man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs, to us, and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her, and she's passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially, what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man, saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, 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 but it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it, and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now obviously I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting meow meow at people. So once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm going to go search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile more, and when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it out again tomorrow. But as I'm headed back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop, and I call out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow, meow in this really odd monotone. As comical as it makes it sound, it was almost like that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I ended up going back to the welcome center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people. But even I have to admit, it was weird.